Welcome to Political Thinking. Two words which increasingly sound like an oxymoron. It does feel that at a time when it's needed most, we are getting precious little political thinking. Our future relationship with Europe, something the country has agonised about for decades and not settled, something which, remember, will not be settled even if we do leave the EU on time or stay in, is now being reduced to mere shouted slogans.
And would you
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
We must stop Brexit.
Stop Brexit, or the slogan bollocks to Brexit on young Liberal Democrat T-shirts, is Joe Swinson's answer to Boris Johnson's Brexit do or die. Both of them produced tut-tuts, muttering, too crude, too divisive, too lacking in political thinking. But of course, all of that misses the point. In the social media age, discourse is reduced to a three-letter word. OMG, LOL, WTF. The more controversial something is, the more it's shared, the more it's liked, and crucially, the more it is noticed by the parts of the electorate that the politicians struggle to reach. Now, Jeremy Corbyn seems intent on avoiding this. For 3 years, he's had a policy on Europe that it's been hard to summarise in a paragraph with multiple sub-clauses. But he knows he's got to say something at the election, which is coming and coming soon. So this week, he's plumped instead for You Decide.
As Prime Minister, I'm offering the people a choice, the only party that's doing so, the only candidate for Prime Minister that's offering that choice. I understand that, I'm also assuring people I will carry it out. I will carry out that choice.
I get all of that, but I mean, can you really stay neutral?
I can never stay neutral when jobs and living standards and trade are at stake, and I will not. But I will make sure that the people of this country have that choice and they make that final decision.
Proof that much of politics is reduced to a shareable video clip came in Luxembourg, when a Prime Minister, Xavier Bettel, simply couldn't resist the powerful imagery of holding a news conference in front of his flag and the Union Jack without the British Prime Minister there.
I wanted to thank Mr. Johnson, who was here today, for the exchange that we had. For me, it was important to listen to Prime Minister Johnson.
Now, all this might make you think that nothing is actually going on, that there is no chance of a deal to take Britain out of the EU. That, I believe, would be a mistake. Look at the meetings not taking place on camera. Look at the words not shouted in slogans. Look in particular at the DUP leader Arlene Foster travelling to Dublin to meet the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar to discuss the boring, vital details of what leaving the EU might mean, the all-Ireland phytosanitary area and how it might be different from the Northern Ireland backstop. Don't worry, we won't be doing a quiz at the end.
What we want to see is a sensible deal that works for us in Northern Ireland, of course, one that works for our colleagues and our neighbours down here in the Republic of Ireland as well, but one that works for the UK constitutional position as well. That's very important.
That meeting might prove to be vital, as might Boris Johnson's meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, who, although the odd word of criticism crept out afterwards, did not rubbish his visitor in the way Theresa May was rubbished when she first met the President of the European Commission, and the world was told that he'd told her she was living in another galaxy.
Well, we're cautious.
Cautiously optimistic.
In my view, it's those four people, Foster and Varadkar, Juncker and Johnson, who hold the key to whether a deal can be done, plus the two vital figures from France and Germany. Merkel, the woman whose favourite phrase is "where there's a will, there's a way," will always favour compromise. The big decision is for Macron. He and French presidents before him have insisted that Britain must pay a price for its decision, not just to teach us a lesson, but to teach other populists as they see them in Europe a lesson too. Their own Marine Le Pen, Orban of Hungary, Salvini of Italy. He will have to decide in the end whether that outweighs the cost to the EU's polity, the cost to its economy that a no-deal Brexit will undoubtedly bring. The other development which is taking place largely behind the scenes is cooperation between MPs of different parties who want to find an agreed way through. One of their leaders is my guest on Political Thinking this week. He's Stephen Kinnock, a mere Labour backbencher, you might think, with a famous mum and dad, of course, but in truth, a vital figure in the weeks ahead. He's the convener of the MPs for a Deal group, one of those Labour MPs who think we should leave, but only with a deal. Stephen Kinnock, welcome to Political Thinking.
Thank you.
Now, read your CV. Son of an MEP and a European Commissioner, married to a Dane, speaks multiple languages, trained at the College of Europe, and you'd instantly just think, Remainer, in favour of revoking Article 50 or having another referendum. And yet, here you are, trying to get a deal to leave the European Union. Do you ever just mull and think, well, how did I end up here?
I think politics is very much about going outside your comfort zone. And you have to think about the people that you serve and what drives them to be contented, what drives them to be frustrated, what makes them want to change things. And certainly my time as a Member of Parliament and working so closely and supporting my constituents has definitely had a massive influence on the way I think about the world and the way I think about what I can and should do to make a contribution. And what's come through so strongly from that is this sense that people from communities like mine have been left behind. They've been ignored, and there's been this shift of money and wealth and resources into London and the southeast and away from the rest of the country. And that's changed my view in many ways about how politics should work, but also how democracy should work.
You represent Aberavon in Wales, a very poor area, an area with a very high number of people who voted to leave the EU. So you're saying, what, the conversations you've had there in a sense makes you think we just can't ignore this referendum. We can't simply cancel it or have another one.
That's been a major factor. But I've also always been, whilst I've been very much in Europe, as you say, married to a Dane, and both of my kids were born in Brussels, I've also always had reservations about the way that the so-called European project has worked. I think it's been too one-size-fits-all. I think there's been too much top-down integration. There hasn't been enough checking with people. Certain parts of the populations of different European countries have benefited massively from free movement of labour, from the single market, from the part that the EU has played in globalisation, if you like, in a turbocharged globalisation that we've seen in the last 30 years. But massive swathes of the populations of Europe have not benefited. And the EU has not, I think, done enough to recognise that and to recognise that different parts of the project need to move at different speeds. So I've actually also seen Brexit as an opportunity to reinvent not just the UK's relationship with the EU, but also to reinvent the EU, the European project in itself.
I asked quite a lot of people who know you, I said, explain it to me. What's Stephen Kinnock up to? And they, and many of them are hugely fond of you, said, he's just running scared of his voters. You're saying it isn't. It isn't either running scared or feeling it's your duty to represent what they voted for. You're saying there's something more fundamental here about your anxieties about the direction that Europe's been going in.
Yes, and I can also say hand on heart that even if my constituency had voted Remain, I would believe that we should respect the result of the referendum. Fundamentally, I am a Democrat. And I think that you cannot overturn the result of a massive electoral event, such as the one we had in 2016, until you've delivered that result.
But that makes people cross, you know that. I mean, the other day, I think you referred to the referendum as the biggest democratic exercise. And then one of your own fellow Labour MPs picked you up on Twitter and said, nonsense, more people voted in the 1992 general election than voted in the referendum. And then I thought very sourly, rather personally, this man called Neil Coyle added, perhaps that's a bit of democracy is understandably deleted from the collective Kinnock family memory. It makes people very angry, this issue, doesn't it?
Well, congratulations to Neil for winning the pub quiz, knowing that there were 100,000 people more in 1992 voted than in 2016. Great, well done, Neil, on that one. But the fundamental point that I was making is that you cannot overturn the result of a referendum, a massive democratic exercise like that, until such time as the result of it has been delivered.
We're going to talk a little bit later about what sort of deal that you think is still possible, and you do still think a deal is possible. But that tweet reminds you in a way of something you never need reminding of, that the name you carry is something you never escape. So someone disagreeing with you about Brexit cannot resist referring back to the 1992 election in which your dad, Neil Kinnock, fought John Major. Do you sometimes feel, I will never escape this?
Well, it made me disappointed in two ways. One, because I think it reflects the deeply radicalised and polarised nature of the debate that we have around Brexit, and it's a shame to see Neil sort of falling into that trap.
Neil Coyle, we should say, not Neil Kinnock.
Yes, yeah, not talking about my dad now. Yeah. But look, I mean, I'm massively proud of my parents. I'm so proud of what they've done. They've dedicated their lives to public service, and they've inspired me in many ways. On the other hand, I'm a 49-year-old bloke. I've lived and worked in 5 different countries. I have 2 grown-up daughters and a wonderful wife, and I think I can pretty much say that I'm my own man. So it's a mixture, I think it's great. I'm very proud of my family and my heritage, but I'm also proud of what I've achieved in my own life and in my own terms.
Now, a few years back, you were explicit about this. You said, I wanted to get out from under my father's shadow, and one way of doing that was by living and working in other countries. Being a young teenager, which you were, when Neil Kinnock first became leader of the Labour Party, and the press was, if anything, more raucous, more partisan, more pro-Tory, of course, in those days. Was that very difficult to watch him go through that?
Yes, it was never easy. And of course, him appearing on the opening credits of Spitting Image every Sunday evening didn't always help when I went to school the next Monday morning. But were they laughing or teasing? Yeah, bullying there was some laughing and some teasing. But I mean, in some ways, I think that's good for you because it toughens you up, gives you a very thick skin. The media was vicious towards leaders of the Labour Party, but on the other hand, there wasn't social media back then, which I think in many ways is much, much worse and much more aggressive. I always wanted to do my own thing. I've certainly never regretted that I waited until I was 45 before going into politics, because I think it's really important to have wider life experience before you do go into the weird and wonderful world of the Westminster bubble. But, I love this country and I love South Wales, and I always wanted to serve. I think the clincher for me in many ways was my time in Russia.
You were working at the British Council in St. Petersburg.
Yes, that's right, from 2005 to 2008. And the behaviour of the Russian state, the total lack of accountability, the total inability of people to speak truth to power just reminded me how much we take democracy for granted in this country. And in many ways, that was the clincher for me to make me sort of fired up to really come back and get involved here.
I want to talk more about Russia as well as your experiences in Europe. But just before I do, on your father and the family, I'm interested not so much in your comment on him, but what it's like to go through. Now, some teenagers would run for the hills, just try and pretend that's not their name, not want to talk about it, be embarrassed or ashamed. Others would be kind of proud and have the fight in the playground. What was your approach?
Yes, I was always ready to push back. And you've got to be robust. You've got to develop a thick skin. And you've got to realise, that your dad is doing a very special thing. He's a very special guy and was very much in the public eye. But he helped me to have a normal life as well. He would take me to the rugby on a Sunday morning. He was always there when he could be. And mum and dad always gave me a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do and be independent, take my own choices. So that helped me, I think, to have a normal life in as much as you could have a normal life in those circumstances. And I really did. I went to my local comprehensive school in West London, had great friends who I still see a lot of. And, I think that's really important as well, is if you're able to build that normal life outside politics, when you do go into politics, you've got that hinterland that you can fall back on, and that's tremendously important.
You certainly do, which is why it's so fascinating that after a while you decided politics was for you as well. What sometimes people forget is setbacks in politics can be, I would never compare them directly with a bereavement, but almost. And for your father not winning that 92 election, when the hopes of so many rested on ending years of Tory rule, and he believed until right the last minute, didn't he, that exit poll that said he would be our next Prime Minister. Does it feel like a bereavement looking back?
Yes, I'll always remember one of the evenings, I think it was 1 or 2 days after the election, coming home and Dad was just asleep on the armchair in front of the TV, and I just thought how hard it had been for him. And it is something that's very difficult to recover from. And you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, you put everything into it. But it's also really important, and he will say this as well, not to regret, not to look back in anger, but to say you gave it your best shot. And when you actually look at what he built, the platform that he gave for those that came after him, I would say if it hadn't been for him, 97 would not have happened. So there's also, history
he was the
will be
architect
kind
of
to
the
him,
success.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
He was the architect.
Now, it was soon after that you then did go to study in Europe.
Yeah.
You'd been at Cambridge. You've done how many languages?
Well, French and Spanish at that time, yes. Yeah,
and now?
And some Danish, I guess, after a while. But I picked up Russian along the way as well.
Right, okay.
And Danish as well. So, yeah.
So for Welsh yet?
I'm working on the Welsh, but it's very difficult to fit the lessons in. But I have been taking some lessons. And,
You're lucky it's not John Humphreys doing this, because he could test you out.
Humphreys is scary in many ways, even in that.
Yeah, actually, I have no idea if he speaks. He certainly doesn't speak fluent Welsh, but he might have the odd word, I suspect. Yeah. So you then go to study at the College of Europe, which is seen by many people as a sort of Eden for the European elite. It's the place you met Nick Clegg, was there. You met your wife, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who went on to be the Danish Prime Minister. Did you at that time, what were you, in your early 20s?
Yeah, 22.
Mm-hmm. Was that your thought? This is me now. I might go on and be a senior official in the Commission. My career is in this project.
I was fascinated by Europe, having done languages at university, and I've always felt that the world is a small place, and you've got to understand it, and the history of building the common market and the European community and the European Union. I found it an absolutely fascinating experiment, also almost in the way that you can build a new way of international cooperation. But I certainly didn't have a blueprint or a master plan. I wasn't particularly attracted to the idea of going and working in the EU institutions, and I never did, really. A short stint in the European Parliament, but then moved on to the British Council. And I think if Helle at the time had said to me, look, I'm planning to become the leader of a centre-left party in Denmark, I probably would have said, right, I'll get my coat and call a taxi.
So you had no idea
absolutely
that she would go on
idea.
to be Prime Minister
Absolutely
of Denmark?
No. We were both interested in politics. We were both doing the sort of politics and administration stream at the College of Europe, but certainly she didn't have any ambitions at that time to go into representative politics, and nor did I. But at some point, I think she did realise there was quite a lot of baggage in that area in my life.
Yeah, and talking about baggage, you see, you've had to live as a politician in your own right at the centre of events now. First with being the son of not just someone, but two someones, and then being the spouse of someone by being the husband of the leader of Denmark. Was there a moment you just thought, I thought I'd given this up? I thought I was being Stephen Kinnock.
I think it's you can run but you can't hide. Yeah. Would probably be the slogan to use there. Yeah, utterly bizarre, Nick. What are the chances of that? It's 1 in a billion. We've never really figured out how that happened. But I suppose if you've come from a background where you're interested in politics and you're then likely to meet other people who are interested in politics, I suppose the stars align in one way or the other. But I'm tremendously proud as well of what Helle did, and so happy that I could support her in my limited way in helping her, to be the first ever female leader of the Danish Social Democrats in Denmark, the first ever woman Prime Minister, and that is a truly historic achievement.
Because it was the first, there was a kind of fascination, maybe because of Borgen later as well, that TV show, Danish TV show about a woman Prime Minister. And there was this sort of implication that you were living that life. I mean, I know her a little and know you. I hope she won't think it's patronising to describe her. She's a glamorous figure, your wife.
Sure,
She gets attention.
Yeah.
And as a result, so did you. That's not sort of in the job description, is it? How did you learn from Dennis Thatcher, or how did you decide how you should handle being the first husband?
Yeah, well, it was not easy because I was for much of the time away in St. Petersburg. I also had my time in Sierra Leone and then working for the World Economic Forum in Geneva. So I was not what you would call the orthodox and average spouse of a prime minister. I mean, I think it cut both ways in Denmark. I think a lot of people felt that it was great for Helle to have an international connection through her husband, and the Danes love the Brits. They love the UK, and they're of course extremely concerned about what's happening with Brexit, etc. So, I think that gave an extra string to Helle's bow in some ways. But of course, it sometimes had its awkward moments when I wasn't always able to be there for a certain event or function. But we made it work. It was an unusual arrangement, but that I guess is how Helle and I have managed to make things work over the years.
So you mentioned that you were in Russia for some of that time, working for the British Council, and that became quite a story as you were arrested and extraordinary allegations were made about you. Tell us the story.
Yeah, I wasn't actually arrested, actually. It was a very difficult situation that we got into in Russia because we were there in the middle of the Litvinenko crisis, and the relationship between the UK and Russia had been bad for many years, and it went into the deep freeze at that point. And it got to the stage where they, in essence, hauled my entire Russian team. I had about 25 Russian colleagues working for me in the St. Petersburg office. They were all hauled into the KGB, the FSB, which is what used to be the KGB in the St. Petersburg headquarters, and told that they should no longer be working for the British Council. And then that night I drove home to my flat in St. Petersburg, and the Russian police were waiting outside, and they tried to make me take a breathalyzer test, which I absolutely refused to do because it was clearly part of a political stitch-up.
You thought they were going to frame you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd obviously just driven home straight from where I'd been with my colleagues, and they were, I think, absolutely set on framing me for that. So that just wasn't going to happen. I got permission from the Consul General in St. Petersburg not to take the test. You can then claim your diplomatic immunity, which is what I had. And it was a very, very unpleasant experience. I eventually managed to get into my house, almost had to sort of push my way through the police officers who were trying to impede my path. And then the next day, the British Council decided really I needed to leave. I was never actually expelled from Russia, and I actually went back there a few times when I was working for the World Economic Forum, and still have a very soft spot for Russia and the Russian people. But the way in which the government behaves there, the way the authorities just impede progress in that country and liberty and freedom, and trying to control in ways which go completely against human rights and civil rights is an absolute disgrace.
Were you frightened, or did you just think, I know what's happening here, I'm a pawn?
I was. I mean, I was speaking with them in Russian and explaining why I wasn't going to take that test. They started to become a little more aggressive, and the point came where I just decided I was going to get out of the car and get into my flat. And it was a deeply unpleasant and quite, I'm not ashamed to say it was quite a frightening experience, but I think it's not anything like as frightening as what the average Russian person has to put up with whenever they step out of line in the eyes of the Kremlin. And so, that is very much an experience I'll never forget, and it will always remind me of how we must never take our democracy for granted.
Now, talking of which, you're having this fascinating life, rather well paid, glamorous family, you're flying around the world. What then makes you think, you know what I must do? I must commute once a week or once every couple of weeks to a part of South Wales and go into the House of Commons. Why? Why not carry on with the life you've got?
Well, we talk about families as inspiration, and in many ways, my grandparents are an inspiration. My grandfather on my father's side was a coal miner. On my mother's side was a railway signalman, and as Welsh as the hills. And I always took inspiration from them and what they did and what they built for their families and the platforms that they gave to my mum and dad to go on achieve, and of course turbocharged by the wonderful things that Labour governments did, particularly the 1945 government. So it's about remembering where you come from. Never forget where you've come from. And my grandparents have certainly been an inspiration to me. And I think that combined with what I did internationally just made me realise that if you do want to change things, so much of it is local. So much of politics and changing people's lives is local, and that's where you have to be.
But the change you're focusing on now is to try and ensure we don't leave the European Union without a deal, that we do leave, but with a deal.
Yes.
And as soon as you leave this studio, you're heading off onto the Eurostar, going to see Michel Barnier. What gives you the belief that a deal can be done, given the signs look so bad?
Well, I think when you look at the Prime Minister's options, he can either break the law by refusing to seek an extension, or he can resign, or he can do a deal. And I would assume that of those three options, that last one would certainly be his preference. So I think the government is boxed in many ways. There is a growing recognition that a compromise is the only way that we're going to get through this and have a chance to bring our country back together. I think from a political point of view, an electoral point of view, and a general election whilst we're still under the shadow of Brexit will be a complete and utter disaster for the country, and I think also disastrous for the Labour Party.
What some of your critics say, as you know, is what on earth is he doing trying to save Boris Johnson's bacon? He's giving him a way out. We should let him fail.
I do not see it that way, because the way to have a general election that would be best for Labour in terms of the bread and butter issues, but also thinking about the political dynamics with what's happening on the right wing of politics, is to have a general election which is about the bread and butter issues of health, education, future of our kids, future of our communities. Remember those things that politics used to be about? That's where Labour did so well in 2017. And those are the messages that resonate on the doorstep.
So the deal we're talking of has to be some sort of variant of the deal that Theresa May did, rejected 3 times in Parliament. Do you believe the politics has changed, that the people who voted against it might now be prepared to vote for it? Or do you also think it can be changed?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that the deal that Theresa May announced after the cross-party talks back in May was as much a Labour deal as a Tory one, because we'd extracted some really important concessions there about a customs union, about environmental and consumer standards, about a parliamentary lock on the future negotiations, on the future relationship. So I think it's something that Labour can say, look, we co-own this, and that's why we should be voting for it. That's why we should be supporting it. And I think it was a massive error to pull out of those talks and to dismiss that deal at that time.
But the likelihood is that you don't convince your front bench that this is not a deal that Jeremy Corbyn wants to back. And therefore we're talking of, a handful of you, couple of handfuls of you, voting with the Tories, voting with the DUP. Are you willing to do that? And are there enough of them willing to do it to get a new Boris Johnson deal over the line?
I'm not saying that the withdrawal agreement bill that comes forward should be a carbon copy of what was done in May, but it needs to be as close as possible to that in order not to alienate Labour MPs. But we're also not giving carte blanche here. This can't just be any old deal. But nevertheless, so much is still up for grabs in terms of the transition period where the negotiations on the future relationship which would take place. So I do think colleagues need to recognise that we're very close to the cliff edge of crashing out without a deal. We have a Prime Minister who's shown that he can be pretty ruthless and reckless. So those who want to prevent no deal need to recognise that the best and safest and least risky and most achievable way of preventing no deal is to leave with a deal.
The most fascinating thing about political moments like this, a little bit like the 75 referendum, is people who've never worked together, possibly never spoken to each other, are forced to. Now, your group MPs for a deal is cross-party. That's the very point of it.
Yes.
You're having to get to know Tories that you didn't know. Are you finding with them, with others, that you think they're not so bad after all, these people? I can do business with them.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. There's so much that we disagree on. But what we've seen with the referendum and Brexit, it is an issue that cuts across traditional party lines. I think that's been quite healthy for Parliament, and it's created a kind of more collegiate atmosphere, certainly in terms of MPs who I would describe haven't gone out to the polls and are very much thinking about what's right for the country. I mean, you can call us the moderates if you like. You know, I believe that the national interest comes first, and sometimes you have to put narrow tribal party loyalties to one side in the national interest.
Now, those loyalties have been stretched for a lot of people anyway. I mean, you were one of those people who thought Jeremy Corbyn shouldn't survive as leader. You backed an attempt to remove him when Owen Smith ran against him. Are you reconciled now, or do you still think the truth is the Labour Party won't win an election under Jeremy Corbyn?
I think that Jeremy he's elected twice, and he will lead us into the next general election. Of that, there is no doubt. I am fully behind the radical Keynesian economic policies that we set out in our 2017 manifesto. The economic model in this country is broken, and only a Labour government can fix it. Where I think we really need to strengthen our offer to the British people is around issues of, if you like, culture and values and national security, and making sure that people understand that we love this country and that we are patriots and that we want to bring this country together, and that we are listening to those communities that have been left behind and not listened to for 30 to 40 years, who've been, I call them the communitarian communities, people who are very much rooted in the place that they live, that have a strong sense of local identity, that are really committed and active often in their community, and feel that London has become this sort of spaceship that's floated off from the rest of the United Kingdom. And Labour has to show that we're not just the London Labour Party, we are a whole nation party. And that means having the right cultural and values offer, as well as the right policies on the economy.
Just spell out culture and values. You mean it's being strong on defence, proud of the country?
Yes, absolutely. And on immigration, a clear policy which says we recognise that the rapid pace of immigration has had an impact on certain communities, which has been very destabilising and very difficult to absorb. And we want an immigration policy which is also all about integration and a value, a language which talks about what we have in common as a country, not just what sets us apart.
Just finally, how lively are those family meals? I'm thinking the former Prime Minister of Denmark is at the family meal, a former MEP, a former leader of the Labour Party and European Commissioner. I've just got an instinct that you don't only chat about, past the roast potatoes.
Yeah. Well, you'd be amazed, Nick, about how much of the conversation is about the kids and about life and general chit-chat. But yeah, of course, we do get on to political issues, and it occasionally gets quite heated.
They tell you off. Hella told you off on camera, I remember. Yeah. You were being filmed at the general election, and you wanted to go onto the telly and say what you thought about what was happening in the Labour Party. She said, "Why are you doing this?" She said. Stop it.
And then, of course, I went on and did it anyway. But that's the great thing with Hella. She never holds back, always gives me the honest, unvarnished truth. And, that's why I love her so much.
And, of course, you can say on this programme, because I'm sure she won't be listening, that she is always right.
She is always right, but sometimes her rightness can be slightly adjusted by a slightly different view that I may have, in about 1% of the time.
Final question, because you've got to get that Eurostar. People listening to you who don't know you will think, he does sound like Neil Kinnock. He's a London boy and Neil was a Welshman. Neil was a lover of rhetoric.
Yeah.
You're quite a softly spoken guy. Are you very different, or is there something? What's the connection?
We're very different people, actually. We're great mates. But I think you definitely have a kind of, well, that's my dad and that's not me. And a big part of that is, he is more expansive than me, I think.
You could say that again. I'm told he stood on a table and sang your stag night. Yeah, I know someone who was there.
My goodness, I'm amazed. I don't remember much of that, but I think that's not just an urban myth.
Yeah.
But no, I think what I have from him is a very strong strain of pragmatism, actually. I mean, of recognizing that you've got to find solutions, you've got to do deals, you've got to work with people, you've got to build coalitions, you've got to understand it's not just about what the party and party members say and think. It's also about what the entire country thinks. And I think if you look at his record in politics, you'll see that there's a pretty direct line between what he believes and what I believe in that sense.
Stephen Kinnock, thank you for talking to Political Thinking.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Now, you might be wondering why I didn't ask Stephen Kinnock the obvious question. Does he want to follow his dad and become leader of the Labour Party? Does he want to deal with that shadow by becoming Prime Minister too? I didn't ask it because I knew he'd dodge the question. But what you heard there, I thought, was a fascinating glimpse of a politics that might yet emerge. His suggestion that the key to the success of the Labour Party is the economics of Corbyn at McDonnell, what we traditionally call left wing, but combined with a traditionally much more right-wing view than theirs on defence and patriotism and immigration. And in case you're wondering whether that could ever work, look to the country of his wife, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, where the Danes have just elected another woman Prime Minister of the centre-left with an agenda very like that. Indeed, I talked with Helle about it on this very podcast. Go to BBC Sounds and you can find it and all the other past podcasts. That's it for this week on Political Thinking. The editor is Martin Rosenbaum, the producer is Peter Snowden, and the studio manager this week, Cassie Galpin.